So, hi James, welcome to this conversation that we're going to have about spiral somatics, which I could say you're something of a specialist in, and I think that would be an understatement, in that you, I think, are the only guy on the planet teaching spiral somatics. Is this correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, so you are the go-to source for this. Before we get into it, because I'd like to get a little bit of the history where this comes from, because it's particularly interesting that you are unique in being the only guy on the planet teaching this, and there's a reason for that, so I'd like to get into that. But before we do, for people who are listening to this, for people who haven't looked at the information page on this as yet, could you give us a nutshell description of spiral somatics? What is it in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, it's about the mind-body link. One of those things that many people are quite aware of. When you're doing certain things inside your mind, your body responds in certain ways. Most people know, for example, that if someone's not feeling particularly chipper and cheerful, they'll generally be slumped over a little bit. So there's certain kind of correspondences between your state of mind and your physiology. And spiral somatics, we're just exploring that in a lot more depth, because there's, to my experience so far, I've not yet found a limit to this. Anything that happens inside of you is going to be expressed in your body. And so that extends, and the kind of thing that we're going to be exploring in spiral somatics, that extends to things not just like your emotional state at the time, but also things like what you value in life, the kinds of things that you believe to be common sense about the way that the world works, the kinds of aptitudes that you have towards things, your priorities, the things that motivate you, the things that don't motivate you. You know, all sorts of things like this are there in your body. They are expressed in your physiology from moment to moment. And that, in a nutshell, is what it's about, being able to read that and being able to use that information also to be able to draw on these things from the inside by gaining greater control over your body and therefore your internal experience.
Okay, so I mean that's a pretty interesting thing, because most people get that, you know, people leak things out in terms of their emotions through their physiology, but this stuff that you're talking about here is a whole different level. I mean, you're talking about values here. I mean, the stuff that, you know, the old thing about values is what has us get out of bed in the morning, do all the things that we do. You're talking about a lot subtler psychological processes being revealed through the physiology, through the body.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, the interesting thing for me in this is people have this idea of a mind-body split, but of course that isn't necessarily the way we work, is it?
No, not at all. You are, there's lots of metaphors that people use for things like this. One of the most common metaphors that people have for brains, for example, is these kind of technological computer-based metaphors. You know, your mind is like a computer, which is bollocks. You know, it's not the case. You're not a machine. You're a living, learning, adaptive organism. You're constantly growing and changing and expanding and adapting and all of these things. And you are a single organism. There's no part of you that's separate from any other part of you. It all works together organically.
So that makes sense that, you know, if there isn't really, you know, this mind-body split idea is a convention, a way of thinking about things rather than reality, and we are thinking. Everything that we do psychologically, we do physiologically, you know, thinking is a full body act. It seems to me. And I think this is the genius of spiral somatics is tuning into the subtleties of that and saying, okay, well, thinking as a full body act, what is being revealed to us about how this person is making sense of the world in this moment. You talked a moment ago about we're not machines.
Yeah.
And you are a trainer of neurolinguistic programming, which often kind of, you know, uses this machine metaphor.
Yeah.
From that perspective, I'm interested because, you know, as a trainer of NLP, how is spiral somatics different from NLP?
Yeah. Before I respond to that question, I want to respond to something that was inside the structure of that question as well.
Yeah.
So NLP doesn't use computer metaphor. NLP doesn't use anything. People use metaphors.
Right.
And there are certain people that favor computer-based metaphors, programming and circuitry and connections and all of that kind of stuff. But that's not everybody. If you've been exposed to NLP only through the filter of one or two major schools of NLP, then you will have been exposed to a lot of machine-computer kind of metaphors about us human beings. But if you were exposed to different schools of NLP, you will have been exposed to different metaphors. So it's a field where, depending on how you come to this field, you might have certain ideas about it, but there's a lot more to it. But in terms of how spiral somatics differs from NLP, it differs in a number of ways. So one of the ways in which it differs from NLP is that, well, it differs from NLP applications, let's say, is that it's not a set of techniques for doing some specific set of things. So a lot of the stuff that people think of as NLP, which isn't necessarily NLP, but what they think of as NLP, is the byproducts of the modeling process, the techniques that come out, the processes that come out, which are largely application based. Here's a process for doing this specific thing, for getting this specific outcome. Spiral somatics isn't like that. It's closer, I guess, to things in NLP like calibration or representational systems or stuff like that, things that are not actually a technique designed to get a specific outcome, but are instead a set of skills that allow you to make sense of things, allow you to organize your experience and make decisions and all of that kind of stuff more effectively. But it's the result of what some people might describe as a modeling project, and some people might not, depending on who they trained with and what their views are on modeling. This comes from the work of, there's kind of two stages. Although spiral somatics is the stuff that I teach, I didn't bake this stuff up from scratch. This is my extension of and refinement of some pioneering work by my mentor Roger Dina, who many years ago was inspired to discover, are there ways of detecting the model of the world that somebody's operating from through their physiology. And he experimented with a few things, and then in the end worked in collaboration with a bunch of chiropractors to discover certain common spinal patterns, common physiological patterns exhibited by people who do the world in certain ways. And so, Roger did some extraordinary things in terms of translating that into things that you could track and make use of in your own physiology. But Rog only mapped some pretty basic distinctions, the kinds of things that I teach in the first 2 or 3 days of Spiral. Roger mapped that kind of level of distinctions, which is a fairly broad set of distinctions. But people are a lot more complex than that. And while Roger was quite adept at being able to recognize that complexity and navigate that complexity, he never mapped how physiologically to track that, how physiologically to access those degrees of complexity. And so I spent some time basically modeling and doing some pattern detection in terms of what sorts of things was he responding to that allowed him to detect that kind of complexity. And then went out into the world and extended on that, and went and exposed myself to lots and lots of different people who did certain models of the worlds to find out what other patterns might be there physiologically, etc. So some people might describe that as a modeling project, and some people might not, depending on where they came from. But the end result of it is not so much a set of techniques about how to do things. It's a set of skills that allows you to shift certain things internally in yourself and allows you to recognize things on the outside world. And that opens up a variety of choices, a little bit like maybe perceptual positions. Perceptual positions, for people who are familiar with this, is not a process that's designed to create some particular kind of change, but it's a process that, when you engage in this process, develops in you insight into ways in which you can make choices and make better choices.
Yeah, that's something that I find particularly interesting. Because are you still there, James?
I am still here.
Oh, yes, we're still online. Yeah, that's something that I find particularly interesting, because it's easy to look at spiral somatics as being, I can get how people work, I can elicit their values with it. Well, elicit their values seems not quite the right phrase here, but I can get a bead Say again?
You could see their values.
Right, yeah, you can see their values. It's not so much an elicitation, they're playing out right in front of your eyes. And it can be very easy to go, oh, yeah, that's great, because now I'm going to have my hands on the levers, I can influence these people more easily, which is true. But it's this idea of being able to actually connect into seeing things or experiencing things much more as they do. Almost being able to take a radically shared perspective with somebody who's doing the world in a very different kind of way. And I find this particularly an interesting thing because there's this idea that goes back to Alfred Korzybski about, the map is not the territory, and this idea of if we can see that everybody sort of occupies their own unique reality tunnel in a way, we can see that other people just see things differently. They're not mad or they're bad, but they're different. And I think this is a great thing from general semantics. But where it falls short is it doesn't really give you any insight into how other people might see things. Okay, we can say everybody lives in their own separate reality, but it doesn't give us any tools to step into that reality and kind of experience it firsthand for ourselves. And I think this is something that is really strong with Spiral, and the benefits of that I find fascinating. I had a huge. I mentioned this in the video that I shared before about my experience going to Santa Monica and meeting a whole array of different people and just being able to kind of shift gears and shift into a sort of shared beingness with a whole range of people. And it's a weird and almost magical thing to be able to do. Have you got any thoughts on that you would want to add to that side of things, that end of things?
Yeah, I would, and largely because I'm talking to you. So I watched your video, and you focus on certain things in your video that are really the core for me of what Spiral Somatics is really all about. It's not the way that I usually sell it. So there's the things that are the most valuable, and there are the things that are the most marketable. And so really, if I'm telling people about Spiral Somatics, if I'm marketing Spiral Somatics or promoting it or something like that, I tend to focus on the element of it that is to do with being able to recognize in other people what's going on for them, what their beliefs, values, and attitudes and perceptions are, and how they're likely to get on with different kinds of people, and their skills, all of that kind of stuff. Being able to recognize that in a snapshot, that's one of those things that's marketable. That's one of those things that a lot of people kind of connect with, predominantly coming from that kind of frame of influence, of being able to be someone more influential. And that's the stuff that I usually talk about when promoting Spiral Somatics, but it's not the most valuable stuff. That's kind of the surface level stuff. The most valuable stuff is the stuff that you were kind of talking about in the last video. So since I'm now talking to you now, and this is kind of a follow-up from that, I'll happily talk about that.
Cool.
The essence of this stuff is about flexibility. It's about personal flexibility, about choice. And there's different levels. And I quite like the frame that you used in that last video, the old be, do, have frame. Because much of what's out there in not just in NLP, but in the personal development world is largely about doing things differently. It's largely about behavioral flexibility. And a lot of NLP training is about people developing behavioral flexibility, having different ways of doing things or better ways of doing things in the world. And you can have better ways of doing things in the world and better ways of approaching things in the world. But if that's all still starting from the same fundamental perceptions about life, the universe, and everything, the same fundamental attitudes and values and beliefs that you yourself personally hold, then you've got a wonderful set of tools, but the person holding the tools is still the same person. And you can make use of those tools, and those tools are wonderful and fantastic things, but a world of possibility opens up when, instead of just developing behavioral flexibility, you develop ontological flexibility in your way of being, and epistemological flexibility in your way of making sense of things in the world. And this is real identity level stuff, because the more flexibility that you have, not just in doing things, but in your ways of being in the world, because you've mentioned before just a few moments ago about being able to radically share someone's experience of the world. So someone who does a particular model of the world, being able to really experience what that's like from the inside. But there's a level beyond that where it's not just about experiencing what that's like from the inside, because that kind of has an element of tourism to it. You know, you're going to this new place, and that's really cool. But when you go to this new place and you realize that anytime you want, you can come back to this place, whether or not that person's there. Anytime you want, you can go back into this way of being in the world and inhabit this as an element of the world or some part of the world that you can do, that you can live from. Then you begin to develop a lot of flexibility, not just in your behaviors, but also in terms of how you are, how you make sense of things, how you value things, how you perceive things. Because there are particular models of the world that open up certain choices. There, you know, if you've ever, here's a classic one, if you've ever heard anyone say to you or say to themselves, or if you've ever said to yourself, oh, I couldn't do that, I'm just not that kind of person. Well, that's an indication of a very strong limitation about your perception of your own identity and the limits of your identity. But if you know that you can be that kind of person quite happily and easily, then all sorts of things become possible, because inherent in that phrase, oh, I couldn't possibly do that, I'm not that kind of person, is this idea that for certain kinds of people, things are possible or things are more easy than for other kinds of people. And spiral somatics is really about learning how to be a different kind of person, to be a range of different kinds of people, so that you never need limit yourself with the expression, oh, that just wouldn't be me. I couldn't do that, not that kind of person, because you can be whatever kind of person you want it to be. And in terms of not doing a fake it until you make it kind of thing, not doing the thing that a lot of people do where they, they think to themselves, if I was this kind of person, then what kinds of things would I be saying to people in the world? How would I be dressing? How would I be holding myself? All of that kind of, rather than doing the behaviors of that, you can just access that internally and allow that kind of person to grow inside you very by making use of these distinctions. And that opens up a whole world of possibilities, and that's where the real transformation in this stuff comes from. My primary outcome really in teaching this stuff is to allow people to experience that kind of flexibility of identity, and so they are able to kind of dissolve the boundaries of their sense of, the box that they put themselves in as a person.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I think that's awesome. I have, to me, I say this, I've said this several times to people, this is a truly magical thing. And I'm not saying magical in some kind of, hyperbolic or metaphorical way. I mean, it's literally like as close to magic as you can get for me, because it's this kind of being able to shift in this beingness, not just with your engagement with other people, but in any given moment, of being able to be considering a quote unquote problem, and of course that problem has a structure and it's going to come from a particular way of organizing reality, and to have the flexibility to be able to just shift into a different way of organizing reality, and suddenly have a whole new range of choices open up. It's a wonderful and joyous thing. And I think there's an interesting implication for that. At least this is how it seems to me, and I can only go on my own experiences with these things, is above all that is becoming the person who can shift that way, has a whole kind of other level of meaning beyond the sort of individual V-memes that get explored through spiral somatics. So that's been my experience as well. It's an incredibly generative thing to engage with, and even from what I've done so far, there seems to be so much continually unfolding from that for me. So, and I mentioned this in the video before about my motivation for wanting you to come over and do this. I'm going to ask you in a moment about your motivation for coming over and doing this. But before I do, we had the question before of how is this different from NLP? This is a similar question, but slightly different. What does this bring to the NLP skill set? What does this add in terms of? I won't lead with this question, but what does this bring to NLP?
Yeah, I think if I can be really candid about this, this is one of those things that when I first started exploring it, and even when I learned the real basic elements of this before I kind of extended and expanded on them, when I learned the stuff that Roger developed, this is. Once I kind of got this into my body and into my being, and this is one of those things, by the way, before I come back to this question, we've been talking about this. We've been talking about being able to go into completely different ways of being internally. And you and I know what we're talking about, right? But for most people listening to this, there are going to be people listening to this who will think they know what that means.
Right.
And who, oh yeah, of course, I know how to do that. You just see it the way that this person would see it and whatnot. And but you've experienced this from the inside. It's so much deeper than that. It's a bit closer to. I was talking to a good friend of mine, Sal, the other day. Which, if you ever listen to this, hi Sal. And Sal is someone who I love for many reasons. And one of the things I love about Sal is that she's someone who's had many past lives. She's done so many very different things in her life. She's lived in the corporate world and been a corporate high flyer. She's been a Jillaroo, which is like a cowgirl, basically, right? She's been out in the territory on horses and stuff like that, and with rough as guts Aussies from the country that wrestle crocodiles and stuff. She's been and is now someone who works with people to create healing in the space of both their physiology and also their emotional experience. So she's had all of these different past lives, these different kind of ways of doing things. And Sal can experience things as Sal the healer, for example. But Sal can also experience things as Sal the chick that you don't want to fuck with, who's spent enough time out in the bush with people that would eat you alive. But she's also able to experience things as Sal the corporate high flyer, who's used to operating in particular ways. So these are not just kind of abstract ideas. These are not just, imagine if I was someone like that. She's actually lived those experiences and can therefore draw on her personal references for these things. There's a big difference between the kinds of things that happen when you learn spiral somatics, where you can actually just live these experiences rather than intellectually see things from someone else's perspective. There's a world of difference. And so to come back to the question, what does this add for people who are trained in NLP? I'll presume well-trained in NLP, because there's widely varying standards in this field, and that's a topic for another conversation that I've probably had many times in the past anyway. And so, to be candid, when I first learned this stuff and first really got this stuff, into my body, even the basics of it, even the basic building blocks of this, before I came to develop and extend and refine all of that into what is now spiral somatics, it quickly came to the point that when it came to, first of all, interactions with other human beings, my absolute first filter was spiral. The absolute first thing, before I even went into like any kind of NLP stuff, my first embodied experience with another human being was just going into this person's world, and experiencing and being in this person's world and connecting from the inside. And that, in many cases, would just allow things to be possible which otherwise weren't really possible if I were just doing rapport, for example, with them, because there's a big difference. There's a big difference between those two things. But quite apart from that, learning this stuff allows you to make much better choices and much wiser choices in terms of the ways that you go about doing things. So one of the things that NLP, for example, is very good at is you learn all of these processes for creating certain kinds of change. And if you practice them and you get good at them, then you know exactly how to do this particular thing. You know how to do this particular process. You know how to make this particular change. What NLP doesn't really teach, right? There may be some people who are very good at what they do incorporate this into their trainings, but by and large, most people don't. What doesn't really get conveyed in an NLP course is, okay, so you might know how to do that, but do you know when to do that and when not? And when something might be more appropriate, and when you just need to just sit and listen to this person. This person just needs to pour things out of their heart. It's about choice points. It's about wisdom. It's about knowing when to do things and when not to do things. And sometimes people will come and they'll consciously state some kind of an outcome. They'll, you might be a therapist, or you might be working in corporates. You might be working in change management or something like that. You might be a corporate trainer. Someone says, "This is what I want," or "This is what we want," and spiral somatics is one of those things that allows you to be able to get quite rapidly what's underneath their wanting of that. Is that something that they want for a particular purpose? Is that something that they are wanting because that way they don't need to pay attention to something else that they desperately need to change but they don't want to face up to? It allows you to develop a lot of wisdom in terms of what's going on internally for this person, and it also allows you to recognize what their strengths are straight away, and what their weaknesses are straight away. And this is quite valuable in terms of any kind of strategic leverage, because you can utilize someone's strengths to help develop their weak points, and you can see how, for example, there are certain things that you're not going to really need to do with this person or with this team or with this organization, because they've got that sorted, right? They've got all of the resources internally to be able to do those kinds of things. There are other things that are likely to get them in trouble. There are other things that might be blind spots for them, that are likely to lead them into situations there, or might result in them being in certain situations where things begin to fall down a little bit because there's something that's missing. There's some kind of key things that are missing there in terms of their own personal resources and stuff like that. And so by recognizing those things, you can head things off at the pass. And can create much more systemically generative change with people. But the other thing, of course, is influence. What is this? So if someone, for example, is learning NLP predominantly for business purposes or for the purposes of being someone more influential, it's an absolute no-brainer. The moment that you see someone, you know exactly what kinds of things are going to turn them on. You know exactly kinds of things to say and do to move them from one place to another. It's just, it's magic. As you put it before, it's magic.
Yeah, that's interesting. That kind of touches. It already begins to answer a question that I have here, and this is a question. I'm going to read this question as it is, and I know this question needs a lot of sorting out, so to speak. But I'll let you hear the question as it is, and I'll let you do the sorting out. Okay. So the question that's come in is: does counselling with spiral somatics work with people who have had troubled childhoods, i.e., the heavy stuff? Or is it more appropriate for stuff like bad habits, motivation, and so on? So go on, James, sort that question out. Sort it out.
Right. Well, it's fairly straightforward. So there's a couple of things that are presupposed in that question.
Yeah.
One of them is that spiral somatics is for counselling. That's a fairly standard kind of, jumps right out there in the question.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that there are different kinds of issues, and that they exist at different levels of complexity or difficulty or whatever it might be. So let me start with this. Spiral somatics is not a counselling methodology. By the imagination, it's a way of recognising what's going on for people, and it's a way of being able to develop that flexibility of being in yourself. Both of which allow you to make really good choices with people. And so assuming that you are someone who knows what you're doing as an agent of change already. So this is, if someone was setting out to, if someone wanted to become a counsellor, to become some kind of therapist or something like that, and they were thinking that a good pathway to do that would be to learn spiral somatics, that's not a good way to, you're not going to learn much therapeutic stuff here. This is not a therapeutic methodology. It's not what it's about. But if you're already trained, if you're already experienced, if you're already someone who does this kind of work, and you work with people and you help people, then this will definitely make a massive impact in the way that you do that. And it will, this will be regardless of whether this is someone who's had childhood issues or whatever, because it's not about where things come from. It's not about, well, actually, a little bit of it is actually a little about where things come from. But it's not predominantly about that. What it's predominantly about is the ways that people have adapted their way of being in the world. And so, you meet someone, you work with someone who's got a particular way of being in the world, then you'll be able to understand that way of being in the world. You'll be able to understand the strengths of that way of being in the world, how that's been working for them. You'll also be able to understand the drawbacks of that way of being in the world, and so the kinds of things that are where they're likely to hit bumps, the kinds of places where they're likely to get in trouble, given that particular way of being or combination of ways of being in the world. You'll also get some pretty good ideas on the basis of the sorts of things that they're experiencing and the sorts of things that they want to experience. You'll have some pretty good ideas about what other ways of being in the world are going to be useful for this person as additional choices in how they are. And by recognizing that and working towards that, you can do some pretty profound things, regardless of what this person has got going on, regardless of where those things started, because it's not about where things started, it's not about a therapeutic technique, it's about being able to recognize where someone's coming from, being able to know deeply experientially the benefits of that and also the limitations of that, and also being able to know experientially what other ways of being in the world are going to be more supportive of this person, and also develop some ways of getting them there.
Thank you. That's a fantastic answer, because I know there's a lot here to offer coaches, on a variety of levels. Not just in how you're meeting and being with and interacting with your client, but also in terms of assisting them and accessing resources that maybe they've not had so readily to hand before now. I'm going to ask a sort of slightly curveball question here, and it might be one that you're not, that you don't really have any position on or any thoughts on, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway because I'm personally curious. Is there a relationship between some of the spiral, I've called them reality tunnels in my previous video, I don't know if that's an apt phrase or not, and Jungian archetypes? I'm going to spit it out. I don't know if this is your field or your area, or if you have any particular perspective on this. You may not, but I'm going to ask the curveball question anyway.
And I do not.
Okay. It's an area of particular fascination for me, the idea of archetypes, these kind of patterned potentialities in us as human beings. And I'm sure there's huge overlap potentially in there with Spiral. It's something I'm personally curious about, and I wondered if you had any insight into it. But hey, I guess I'm just going to have to do that bit of research and exploration myself.
I guess so, because here's the thing. This is... I know that I'm different from some NLP trainers in that a lot of people in my field have this thing where they need to be seen as the expert in all things that are even vaguely related to this. And so they'll congruently answer every question with a yes or a no, or, well, this is how this works and stuff, even if they don't actually have a lot of expertise in that. And I'm not a fan of that. I'm someone who has absolutely no trouble whatsoever saying I have no idea. And so every now and then people will ask me questions about things that are outside the scope of my personal expertise. And when they ask me those questions, I will generally go, well, I don't know. And so, Jungian archetype, I just don't know enough about that stuff. I couldn't draw any, like people sometimes, as an NLP trainer, will ask me lots of questions about neurology and how the brain works and how this relates to various things. I don't have a PhD in neuroscience, I've read a couple of things. I've done the same kind of, in-depth research, Googling and freaking Wikipedia and stuff like that, that your average Joe with access to an internet browser has done, but I don't believe by any stretch of the imagination that even comes close to the kind of expertise that someone who's actually studied this stuff formally. I've got, whenever somebody asks me these kinds of questions about neurology, I'll generally respond with, that's a great question, I'll ask Judy sometime, because one of my students has got a PhD in neuropsychology. and actually has studied the brain, postgraduate levels, all of this, like knows infinitely more than I am going to know, even if I spend a whole hour Googling articles on the internet about neurology or reading a couple of pop psychology books or whatever it might be. So whenever something comes up that's a question that's outside of my area of expertise, like well outside of my area of expertise, I might have an opinion about it. If I don't have an opinion about it, then I'll just go, I don't know. Prefer to do that rather than lead people down some garden path and have them thinking that I'm the source of all knowledge of all things or something like that. It's not a useful thing to do.
Yeah, and you know, we've never talked about Jung or anything like that before, so I wasn't sure if you had any perspective on that. And I also know you well enough to know that if you didn't, that was the kind of answer I was going to get. So, but hey, you know, I thought I'd ask. So thank you for everything that you've shared here, James. I've asked most of the questions or variations of most of the questions that have come in. I have another question I'd like to ask, which is, do you have an explicit vision for spiral somatics kind of going forward in the world?
I do.
You do?
I do. And I was wondering when we were going to get to this, because you started quite early, and even in your previous video, mentions the fact that I might have my own outcomes for coming to the UK and whatnot. And my vision is fairly straightforward. I want this stuff to be out there in the world, and this is because I came to develop this in the first place because what I learned from my mentor, which was is kind of the basic building blocks from which I've then kind of expanded and developed that stuff into spiral somatics. Even the essential building blocks of this stuff that Rog first started exploring back in the day are so immensely valuable that it was just it was a crime not having these things be widely known beyond just people who had learned from Rog, for example. And so when he decided to retire, I said, look, I want to keep working on this stuff. I want to keep developing this and expanding on it and keep teaching things and all that kind of stuff. Do I have your blessing? Do you have your permission to do that? And he said, yes. And I went, great. And kept on working on it, kept on developing, kept on refining and expanding. Because I perceived it as a crime not to have this stuff be out there and known by more than just the people who had learned from Rog, for example, even the basic stuff, And so since then, over the past, I don't know what it's been now, 10 years, 15 years, I've been developing and expanding and extending and refining and have developed this into what is now spiral somatics. And then I think it was last year or a couple of years ago, I sat down with one of my students in the training room while some people were on an exercise. And she was asking me some questions about this. And I told her the same thing. And she said, okay, cool. So apart from the people who have now learned spiral somatics from you, how many other people in the world know this stuff? And of course, the answer to that is, well, none. Right? So all I've done is I've just replicated the same kind of scenario, but with an extended and more developed thing, And so the moment that I had that conversation, I had that moment of realization of like, oh, fuck, I started out with this idea of kind of spreading this stuff out in the world and have it so more people know about this because it's so important. And I hadn't really done that. And so it's my intention now I want to kind of spread this around the world, make sure that lots of people have learned this. And then the next step from that is to cultivate some people who can teach this elsewhere in the world. Once I've got, a few other people out there teaching spiral somatics in the world, then I feel like I've done my duty. And then I can explore other things guilt-free.
Right.
Know that there are people out there that are still teaching this. There are people in the world that are kind of spreading this out there, that this is not something that is going to die, right? Because it's just too valuable. It's way too valuable. And so it needs to be out there and more people need to experience this.
Cool.
And my other, thing for coming to the UK is that I just like traveling.
There is one last question which actually pops out here, and I know a few people have asked this. A lot of people say, hey, James, are you going to be videotaping this and putting this out as an online program afterwards? And I have said the answer to that is no. But I know that people, you've been asked if you would put some kind of online training out on Spiral before, haven't you?
Yeah, for about 10 years, or probably more than 10 years, people have been asking that.
Right. And would you say something about why that hasn't happened and if that's likely to happen and all of these things?
Yeah, the reason why that hasn't happened is that it's Spiral somatics. It's predominantly about physiology. It's predominantly about really developing a very fine degree of control over your own physiology as a way of being able to access these different ways of being in the world. Which is one of those things that if I do a video program, if I do an online video program, I can show people stuff, but I've got absolutely zero guarantee whatsoever that they will then be able to make those fine adjustments in their body. Certain gross things they'll be able to get into their body very easily. But those kinds of fine adjustments, I've got no guarantee that that's going to be the case. And so and that's not even all. When people come to the Spiral Somatics training, there's lots of hands-on feedback and lots of hands-on coaching and refinement and stuff that I'm doing with everyone who's going to be there, because I want to make sure that everybody can get this stuff into their body and everybody can get this stuff into their internal experience. And so quite apart from me teaching things to a group, I will also be working individually with every single person in the room to make sure that they really get this, that they get there, that they get this stuff into, because it's really fine distinctions. And doing that stuff on video, it just doesn't sit well with me as something that would allow me to know that if somebody has done this program, they've got some good references for things internally. They might just do it very consciously, very rationally, very disconnected from their bodies. And if they do that, they're not going to get it. You're not going to get this stuff until you really get it into your body. And it just needs to be there live for that. Now, there might be people who, specialize in, I don't know, high-level training for yogis or Pilates instructors or something like that are really good at being able to convey this stuff via video in tiny little minute chunks. And I could potentially do that, but that's the kind of thing that I can imagine many people not necessarily having the patience to spend the next 20 minutes, half hour, working on that particular position of the top of their neck, for example, And so, it's just one of those things that you come and do it live, you can get it into your body because I'll be working with you and I'll guarantee that you'll get it into your body. You get that stuff on video and it's just not going to be there. And the primary thing as well is that when it comes to learning anything, the number one thing that stops learning dead in its tracks, the number one thing that interferes with people's learning that I've found in all of my experience is something that I might refer to as premature understanding. And it's and a lot of people value this. A lot of people, value this idea of feeling like they've got something and feeling like they've got something quickly. And this is the kind of thing that that leads people to approach NLP training. And the moment that some presenter starts with something, they go, "Oh yeah, I get this. This is all about like seeing, hearing, feeling stuff. Cool, I understand NLP now." And or they do that dreaded. How is this different from this other thing? Which, of course, only makes sense if the only thing that you're paying attention to is similarity. But that's a really common pattern that people do. People will experience something, and the moment that they see or hear anything that's vaguely familiar, that seems vaguely similar to something else that they've experienced, they'll immediately put this into the box of, oh, this is just the same as that other thing. And then they close the box and they put the lid on the box and they put the box on a cupboard somewhere and stick the cupboard in the back of it's just... People stop learning when those things happen, because when you reach a state of understanding, that's a state in which you have achieved closure. So the moment that someone goes into a state of understanding or even thinking that they understand something, they go into this state of closure and their learning strategies stop at that point. And so the risk of doing some of this stuff by video is that somebody will watch a video and go, "Oh yeah, I get that." Right? They don't have it in their body, and they'll have premature understanding, and I'm not willing to go down that track.
And I know this fits with your values as a trainer, which is something I find fascinating, because I know that you are an extraordinarily. I mean, obviously, everyone is a values-driven trainer in their own way, but you have a real kind of explicit connection to your values, and almost, so far as I can tell, zero compromise around your training values, and a high degree of rigor in turning out people who are highly skilled in what they do. I may have mentioned it to people before, but people listening to this, if you don't know, so far as I know, James has the most rigorous NLP practitioner training on the planet. I don't know anybody that does anything like the amount of time that you put in, and the quality of the training as well. You've got 28 days high quality training, and that isn't obviously a commercial decision that you're making there. And I think that's an important thing to recognise and understand, is that for anyone who's considering coming on the Spiral Somatics training in Edinburgh, which I shall mention the dates here, which I have to scroll up because I never remember numbers. So yeah, this is 30th of June to 3rd of July is the first chunk, and the 7th of July to the 10th of July 2017 in November. If you're considering coming on this, recognise that this is a deep and rigorous training here, and it's something that you couldn't get by video, even if it was out there, probably, and it's not out there on video, and there's good reason for that. So yeah, we'd love to have you on board. At the point of recording this, there are about half the places now gone. There's been another sale today, so half the places are now gone. That leaves about 10 slots left. And if you're interested in this, seize this opportunity. James, thank you for this conversation. Is there anything else that you want to add before we close up here?
Not really, just apart from the fact that I'm really looking forward to seeing Edinburgh again. It's one of my favourite cities. I like it.
It's a fantastic city. I love it. I can't say enough good things about Edinburgh, and it's Edinburgh in the summer as well. So for those who want to come along and really enjoy the city as well, this is a perfect excuse to come and do so. Okay, thank you, James, and we'll wrap this. Thank you.